My name is Saad Atshan. I'm an associate professor of anthropology at Emory University, and it is my honor to be the host and moderator of today's event with Dr. Perla Issa from the Institute of Palestine Studies, where we will have a discussion on her recently published book, Alf Alf Mabruk. Congratulations, Dr. Issa. I look forward to celebrating your work this afternoon. I'd also like to thank Laura Albast from the Institute for Palestine Studies for all of her help with setting up this webinar and the technical aspects. We couldn't have done it without her. So thank you so much, Laura. We really, really, really appreciate it. So it's really my pleasure to introduce Dr. Perla Issa, who is an accomplished person. She is a researcher at the Institute for Palestine Studies, IPS, in Beirut, Lebanon. She holds a PhD in politics from Exeter University, an MA in Arab Studies from Georgetown University, a second MA in mechanical engineering from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT, and a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from McGill University. Her PhD dissertation, entitled Palestinian Political Factions: An Everyday Perspective, was the 2015 joint winner of the Brismus Lee Douglas Memorial Prize for the best UK doctoral dissertation on the Middle East. Additionally, she co-directed and produced a 6-part independent documentary film series, Chronicles of Refugee, that looks at the global Palestinian refugee experience since 1948. And today we will discuss her book entitled The Endurance of Palestinian Political Factions: An Everyday Perspective from Nahr al-Barid Camp, which was published in 2021 with the University of California Press. And it is part of the New Directions in Palestinian Studies book series, which is an amazing new book series edited by leading figures within the field of Palestinian studies. So welcome, Dr. Issa, ahlan wa sahlan. I'm going to turn it over to you now for some remarks and framing of the overall book project. And then I will ask some questions, share a few reflections, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So please feel free, folks, to type your questions in the Q&A. I will be happy to read those out for Dr. Issa, or you're welcome to, quote unquote, come on stage and ask your question yourself. If you'd like to do the latter, please feel free to raise your hand during the Q&A portion, and Laura will help us call on you to get on stage, so to speak. So Dr. Issa, I hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Saad, for the introduction, and thank you all for joining. I think the best way for me to start would be to begin with the puzzle, the question that kind of led me to embark on this research and to ultimately write this book. And it is, how are Palestinian political factions maintaining centrality in Palestinian political life in Lebanon in the face of widespread unpopularity? How are they reproduced on an everyday basis? And so I think anyone who has who has any basic knowledge about the Palestinian camps in Lebanon would know how unpopular the Palestinian political factions are. And it is actually well documented in academic literature. Tujar Dem, Khawana, Haramiye, Ma'afnin, merchants of death, traitors, thieves, rotten. Those are just some of the terms that Palestinians use to describe their factions on a daily basis. In 2006, 2007, I did a documentary film with colleagues that Saad referred to, where we interviewed over 300 refugees, 300 Palestinians around the world. And out of the 300 people, only one person answered positively to the question, does anyone represent you politically today? So the uniformity of the no answer across geography, age, socioeconomic status was really striking, and really, I think, reflects kind of this general feeling of disenfranchisement that Palestinian refugees feel towards their political representative. And to make my initial question of the continued relevance of Palestinian factions, even more puzzling if it wasn't already. I can add that Palestinians in Lebanon have on several occasions attempted to alter their political representatives. There are several examples, but I'll stick to one, which is the major one, is an election that happened in Shatila camp in 2005, an open election where camp residents voted and elected a committee that they called Bijnat al-Ahali, a people's committee, we can translate it. And just, I guess, as background information, camps in Lebanon have what's called a popular committee. They have nothing to do with the popular committees of the First Intifada. They are supposed to act like a municipality, although camp residents will tell you that they do not. And they are appointed by factions. They are not elected. And they are the object of a lot of criticism from camp residents. So in 2005 in Shatila, there was the first and up until now, the only open election for a committee, and the committee lasted for about a year, resolved electricity issues in the camp, and started working on water problems, and then the members resigned. And the few scholars who wrote about this, and they include Rosemary Sayer, Gianna Allen, Hala Abuzaki, and Manal Kurtan, portrayed this initiative as being independent and grassroots, independent of the factions, and blamed Khanet's demise on the factions. So the question was, how are unpopular factions destroying these grassroots initiatives? And so I began my fieldwork, and once I was in the field, I was faced with a frustration. And I think, again, anybody who's done work in the camps would know this frustration. And basically, I couldn't figure out who was in a faction from who was not. And as you can imagine, this caused a lot of grief, because here I was studying how the political factions are undermining these independent and grassroots initiatives, and I couldn't figure out who was who. And so initially I thought maybe this was related to my position as an outsider, as a researcher who couldn't properly read the politics of the community. But I soon realized that Palestinians themselves had a lot of discussions between each other, kind of arguing about the political affiliation of each other. And to give you an example, a little bit of this confusion, I will share the story of a young man whom I'm calling Mahmoud. So Mahmoud was in his early 20s, and he had several jobs. He was a construction worker by day, working on the reconstruction of Nahr al-Bared, and he was a DJ by night. He owned a sound system and a mixing console, and he performed in political events, bachelor parties, weddings. And he also worked with an NGO in the distribution of aid and in entertaining children, like doing clown activities in theater. So when I first asked Mahmoud about his political affiliation, he told me that he was in principle with the DFLP, مبدئيا. So his choice of words, in principle, made it sound like as if there's another answer, like there's an in practice answer. There's the in principle answer, and then there's the, in reality or in actuality answer. So now when I tried to figure out this other answer, he just told me how during the 2007 conflict, the Nahr al-Bared conflict, he was volunteering with an NGO with Najdi, which is an NGO linked to the DFLP, and that he found himself invited to party meetings, and then became a member, found himself almost as if he became a member of the DFLP by accident. And then several weeks later, So several weeks later, I saw him leading the DFLP scouts in a political march in the camps. And once I saw him, leading the DFLP scouts in an open event, this kind of solidified in my mind. So yes, Mahmoud is a member of the DFLP. Again, a month later, the story continues. In an evening conversation, I referred to him as a DFLP member, and he gets upset. And he tells me, no, I already told you, I'm not with anyone. I'm with my own interests. So here he's insinuating that the DFLP are not looking out for his interests. And it took me about a week to understand why he had gotten angry that night. And he explained that the DFLP were preparing for their annual anniversary commemoration. And they had asked him to provide them with a sound system. And they had offered to pay him $50. But Mahmoud knew the person who had rented the sound system for them the prior year, and he knew that they had paid him $100. So he was, upset. And he sent them a text message, an SMS, which he showed me. He sent it to his superior in the faction, whom I'm calling Abu Mustafa. And the message said, كل عام وانتم بخير ولقيتكم غير, which means like happy anniversary, and you better find someone else. Then a month later,
Dr. Issa, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. We have a comment that says, I'm having trouble hearing Dr. Issa. Could she raise her microphone level? Maybe I'm the only one. Thanks. I actually can hear you perfectly well, but I think some other folks may be struggling to hear you.
okay,
So if you wouldn't mind just speaking up a little bit more and maybe raising the volume of the microphone if possible. Sorry to interrupt your story. I want to hear the rest of this story. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this better? I'll try to raise my voice. So about a month later, I'm riding in the car with Mahmoud, and he tells me of this girl that he met, that he likes, and that they are sending each other text messages, and that he's trying to meet up with her. And then I realized that her father is Abu Mustafa, the same Abu Mustafa to whom he had sent that kind of daring text message to before. And the story continues. So about a few months later, Mahmoud decides to go back to college and to continue his education. And he tells me that he approached Abu Mustafa, and that Abu Mustafa agreed to that the DFLP would pay Mahmoud the $200 annual stipend that the DFLP pays to its students. So one can think that, Mahmoud's interest in the DFLP may be financially motivated, but I would say that if he was looking for kind of a maximization of, his finances, he better go to Fatah, who pay $50 a month, who pay the students $50 a month, so much more than the DFLP. But in this case, he went back to the DFLP, so which shows that his relationship was kind of ongoing. So I think the story kind of drives home 2 points. The first is that if we were to try to define Mahmoud's relationship with the DFLP as being in the faction, as a member or outside of the faction, would have really been impossible. And more importantly, it actually would have missed a lot of the complexity of that relationship. And the second point that this example shows is that the relationship between a person and a faction is not a relationship between a person and a structure that is defined by an ideology, but it is a relationship between people. That basically Mahmoud's relationship with the faction is mediated through relationships with people, and with whom we may have non-political relations. So another way of saying it is that factions and personal relations intermix. And it is through stories like these and many others that I started thinking that maybe we need to re-examine the way we imagine or conceptualize factions. And basically, I contend that while we all know that factions are made of people who enter into different types of relationships with each other, that in the way we talk of factions, and the way we treat them, in the way we study them, and the way we criticize them, we treat them as an entity with a life, as entities with a life of their own that exist separately and independently from the very people they seek to encompass. And one way to visualize this is to say that we treat factions as if they were structures, almost as if they were buildings. And this is actually reflected in the terminology that Palestinians use on a daily basis. For example, Palestinian would say, دخل التنظيم, I entered the faction, as if we're entering a building. Palestinians talk of a سقف سياسي, a political ceiling, talking of the hierarchy in the factions, the vertical limitations. They would say of someone who's factionalized that he has a back, dahr, so someone protecting him. So this image of entering, of a ceiling and of a back really kind of points to an imagination where we see factions almost like a structure, and we do call them political structures. And kind of visualizing factions as building-like structures is actually appealing because it helps us imagine, it helps us demarcate factions from each other. It helps explain the hierarchy inside the factions with kind of the members at the bottom and the leadership at the top. And it helps explain how factions remain even when the people inside change. And even more so, how factions remain when there's no one inside. When they would become empty buildings. And actually, I begin this book with a quote from a young man in Shatila who says that after the departure of the PLO in 1982, the factions became empty buildings, referring to their unpopularity. But still, there is that structure that is left, although there's no people. And I would argue that this conceptualization of factions as building-like structure is also evident in the academic literature on factions. Scholars routinely, we refer to factions as actors, players, political bodies, political structures. We ascribe actions, intentions, aspirations, identities to them. We refer to them in the singular, and we study them mostly through an examination of their ideologies, a history of their founding and their evolution over the years, their regional and international alliances, their sources of funding, without examining the practices, the daily practices of those who form their very core, their members. So in this study, I attempted to adopt an alternative methodology, what I like to refer to as a lateral approach. So basically, I do not look at factions from the top down. I do not look at party literature, writings of party founders, and I do not do interviews with the leadership. And it's not a bottom-up approach either. It's not an ethnography based on what appears to be the inside of factions, which could be faction offices, NGOs that are related to factions or youth clubs. I look at factions from the sides, from homes, from daily home life. And basically, I lived in Nahr for 7 months with a host family. And through that, I was able to see how Palestinians experience the faction on a day-to-day basis, how they encounter them. And it was through this alternative perspective that I was able to see how the nature of factions, how we visualize factions as people or as a building changes really depending on what practice we focus on. So I look at two sets of practices. The first set of practice, first I look at how Palestinians join factions and how the relationship evolves over time. So I look at the nature of faction membership. And I show, or hopefully I show, you would read and decide for yourself, that through these practices, the factions appear as a loose network of people who are bound together with different degrees of trust and cohesion, and that change with time and context. So they lose their appearance of a structure, of a bounded structure, with members inside and the independence on the outside, and that are defined by ideology. Like the Mahmoud example, where we see that the relationship between a person and a faction is really about relationship between people. And then I look at another set of practices. I look at aid distribution, how factions provide aid. I look at factionalism, the violent confrontation of factions, and at anniversary commemorations, how factions commemorate their birth, their founding. And I show how through these practices, factions suddenly now appear as structures, as building-like structures that exist independently of their members. And again, how that boundary is drawn, the boundary between the inside and the outside. So if I can summarize what this book is about, I would say this is an ethnography that aims to show how factions are formed through interpersonal relations, through relations that are highly personal, that have a lot of trust, and how through certain practices they metamorphose into these impersonal structures that are distrusted by the community. So I aim to show this double movement, what I refer to as the double nature of factions. And this, I think, allows us to begin to understand how factions continue to endure in the face of widespread condemnation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think that the last reference you made really stuck out because I noted it in my notes, this quote, this part where you say, by focusing on everyday life, this book shows that particular practices allow factions to metamorphose into structures while hiding the social relations that form their very core. And I will say that I think you demonstrated that very clearly through your rich ethnography. The refugee question is at the heart and soul of the question of Palestine more broadly. We need more attention to quotidian, everyday refugee life in Lebanese refugee camps. And this book really provides us with an amazing set of insights and rich texture of everyday lives. So thank you so much for this amazing book. I really enjoyed it as an anthropologist, as a scholar of Palestine, and I do have so many questions to ask you, but let me try to contain it to a finite set of questions. The first regarding positionality. So I was struck in the book that you mentioned that you come from a Palestinian refugee background, but unlike these folks, you have Lebanese citizenship. So there are ways in which you can really empathize, but there are also ways in which your own experience has been different. So could you tell us a little bit more about your positionality and also the question of access? How did your positionality provide you with access, and what challenges did you face in being able to access this particular context?
Yes. Yep. Actually, yes, I am from I'm a Palestinian refugee, but one with Lebanese citizenship. But also, I actually came to know of my Palestinian identity late in life. I didn't actually grow up with that, but that was due to the civil war and where we lived. I grew up, I was born in Lebanon and I grew up here, and we later emigrated. So I discovered this later in life, and then I visited camps in Lebanon. Um, and I did a lot of work in Nahr al-Bared before I started my research. And this was actually why I chose Nahr al-Bared, because I felt that to do this research, it was fundamental that I have a very deep relationship with the people for them to kind of share these kind of intimate and very personal stories of theirs. So yes, I'm an outsider in a sense. I've never lived in a camp other than for this research. This was the first time, but I was perceived by the community as being by the people who know me well as being Palestinian, but as people who meet me, who were meeting me for the first time, uh, I could easily appear to be also a foreigner. Because obviously I lived for a long time in the West, and I'm so in the way I look, in the way I dress, um, but so I always had kind of this double position. But I would say that with time, and yes, I was involved in Nahr al-Bared for over 4 years before this research. Uh, you know, I was I was seen as a Palestinian.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think you demonstrate very clearly how there are these intimate ties of family, of friendship, of neighborhood ties that help shape the realities of factions and how the political factions and how they're constituted. I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about the question of political economy and how political economy comes together, because you discuss aid, you discuss the need for survival of people's economic, harsh realities, and how you, even in the last vignette that you mentioned in your earlier remarks, you talked about this question of $50 versus $100, and this discrepancy, and how this young man was upset about this as a result. But could you just tell us a little bit more about how political economy shapes these dynamics?
Sure. I mean, definitely factions play an important role um, in terms of helping people financially. Certainly at the time of my research, and even more so now with the economic crisis that Lebanon is going through. But it was very clear to me that that was never the incentive or the reason why Palestinians would choose which faction they would go to. Because if really they wanted, as I said, if they wanted to just get the most money, they would go towards the richer factions, the faction that pay more. And that was not the case. Certainly not in Nahr al-Bared. In Nahr al-Bared, the most the bigger factions are the PFLP and the DFLP. The PFLP gives almost no money, the DFLP gives a little bit more. But certainly being connected to a faction for a long period of time would give you a sort of aid, you know, a sort of protection, not protection, but the sustainability, financial sustainability. And the longer you are with the faction, or the longer that relationship is ongoing, the bigger that financial reward would be. So this is what I mean by the initial contact with the faction was not really justified through monetary incentives.
And you mentioned the critique that many people have of some of the factions and their spending, you know, for example, with the, you know, ceremonies and celebrating the anniversary of the faction, and people commenting, you know, those funds could actually be used to help people instead, rather than have all of this pomp and circumstance. So that was actually quite compelling. You know, as I was reading this book, I was thinking about Laurie Allen, also anthropologist of Palestine, her book, The Rise and Fall of Human Rights, Cynicism and Politics in Occupied Palestine. So I was thinking a lot about the question of affect, and particularly cynicism. So I know obviously there is cynicism. How could you not be cynical in this kind of political context? But could you share with us a little bit more about the question of affect, cynicism with your interlocutors, but as well as how you navigated your own affect and the question of cynicism versus hope regarding not only this question, but I think in many ways it's a window to the larger question of Palestine more broadly. You know, how do we navigate our affect, and how do we hold, is there any hope to hold on to, or is cynicism at this point just a chronic condition?
I'm afraid I don't have an answer to that, especially, you know, I live in Lebanon. So the last 2 years, 2 3 years, I mean, it's been, you know, so we have to hang on to hope, I would say. I don't know. But I mean, to go back to Nahr al-Bared, in a way, I chose to do my research in Nahr al-Bared because as I said, it was where I had kind of the most long-standing relationships, and where I felt that people would be, you know, open and sincere with me. But also because Nahr al-Bared had just been destroyed in a battle in 2007 that pitted kind of the Lebanese army with a non-Palestinian militant group that kind of, you know, found, you know, kind of came into the camp. And the factions stood on the side of that. So there was a lot of resentment and a lot of anger against the factions. So in a way, it was kind of a really good choice to see at this, to examine the endurance of the factions in the face of so much anger and opposition from the residents who feel that they lost everything. And the factions just stood on the sides when, you know, their homes were being destroyed. But yeah, I mean, hope, you know, we have to keep holding on to it.
Absolutely. But I'm also so sorry about everything that's happening in Lebanon. It's absolutely heartbreaking, and I'm praying for you and your loved ones and everyone there. I just have 2 more questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. And we really do encourage people to post questions in the Q&A feature, or to raise their hands if they'd like to ask their questions themselves. But I promise I am getting to the end of my intervention. So just one question regarding Nahr al-Bared and the context now. So much has changed. You know, you talk about in the book that it was the second largest refugee camp in Lebanon in terms of population, etc. But what is the nature of Nahr al-Bared today? What are the conditions there, and how has that changed over time?
Yeah, no, Nahr al-Bared remains the second largest camp in Lebanon. It's still not completely rebuilt. Probably around like between 70 to 80% of it has been rebuilt. The camp suffered a lot after the conflict, because before the conflict it was a kind of a commercial hub, because it's on the main road between Syria and Tripoli, which is the second largest city in Lebanon. It's on the Mediterranean shoreline, and it's in this agriculture. It's in a very fertile area. So a lot of Lebanese farmers used to come to the camp to sell their produce. A lot of residents from Tripoli would go to the camp to buy, goods. They used to smuggle a lot of goods from Syria, so things were very cheap. So it had a lot of economic activity, and it was actually the nature of Nahr al-Bared that was very different from other camps. That was very open to the Lebanese surroundings, and there was a lot of mixed marriages between Palestinians and Lebanese. So the conflict and then and the post-conflict, when the Lebanese army kind of surrounded the camp and imposed these checkpoints, completely, obviously, disseminated this commercial activity. And the camp, so most of the camp residents, which were, traders, lost their income. So definitely the situation is a lot worse. And then now, obviously, with the economic crisis that Lebanon and not just economic, political, social security, the entire crisis that Lebanon's going through, things have, gotten much harder.
Unfortunately. And, my final question is regarding generalizability. I'm not a positivist social scientist at all, but actually sometimes I do find the question of generalizability quite compelling. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how these insights about the political factions, how they're perceived, how people relate to them within this particular context, Palestinian refugees in Nahr al-Bared camp. What does that tell us about political parties more generally around the world? Can we extrapolate in any way beyond this very specific context?
Yeah, no, thank you for this question. I think it's an important one. I mean, at the basic argument that I'm trying to make is that we all know that factions or political parties or UN agencies or NGOs, I think anything that we refer to as a political structure, this is not related to just Palestinians or to Nahr al-Bared. So any political party or political structure, we all know that they are ultimately made of people, that there's nothing more than people. But yet we accept this kind of assumption, this preconceived idea that we have, that they are structures, that they exist independently on their own, separately from the people who are inside. And I try to show is this duality, that they are both. They are a network of people, but yet they also appear to be a structure. And when we treat them as a structure, we also actually give them power. So this duality, this what I call the double nature, is certainly applicable to any other political structure. The context obviously matters, because ultimately what I show is I go through these practices. And practices would change from one setting to another. So if one was to study Lebanese political parties, they would have a very different context and very different practices. But I think at the core, the idea is the same, is that we treat political parties as an entity, but they're actually just made of people. So, so there's this kind of that tension that I look at.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I'm also grateful to Laura Al-Bast from IPS for posting in the chat the link to Dr. Issa's book, which is in open access, free, and so easy to download. So I think that's wonderful that the book is so accessible. And I highly recommend that folks read it. And we do have questions coming in, which is great. And let's start with Pauline Kaufman's question. She asks, I hope you will describe the conditions in Nahr al-Bared now. The terrible destruction of the camp had to have decimated the social structure. Has it been rebuilt? If so, how?
Yes. So Nahr al-Bared, or all camps in Lebanon, they're divided. I mean, there's two things. There's the original camp, which is what they call the old camp, which is the land that UNRWA leased in 1949. And then there's the extension. So Palestinians over the years, couldn't just, live in that original land. So they bought land outside of the camp, around the camp, and they would build. So so UNRWA was responsible for the reconstruction of the old camp. And that's what I was referring to as not complete yet, that around 70 to 80% of that was rebuilt. As for the new camp, what people refer to as the new camp, which is just the Lebanese area where Palestinians have bought land and built, that's really up to the people themselves. There's no kind of outside player. And because of that, actually, in many ways, that has been rebuilt faster, because when you just let the people themselves rebuild, they tend to rebuild faster than this organization who has to kind of rebuild for everyone. So yeah, and as I said, like the camp really suffered greatly from kind of this seclusion that happened to it, being surrounded by checkpoints and kind of destroying all this commercial activity that was at its core.
We have a question from Nasser Al-Masri. Typically, joining a faction comes with some level of political socialization. Does that play out in any way here? Similarly, does it not have some influence on who gets recruited in the first place? Or are social relations, however loose, sufficient for recruitment purposes?
No, absolutely. Actually, one of my main points in the books is that Palestinians join factions based on interpersonal relations. So through political socialization, whether through the family, friendships, or what I refer to as neighborhood ties. It matters a lot. So when a faction has a youth center and you live close by, you'll naturally, you may or you may not, but I mean, you may go to the center to participate in activities. So you really, through these stories, and I go through them in the book, you see how factions, how Palestinians are, how their first contact with the faction is through these personal relations. And this holds true for both the Thawra generation and the younger generation, the generation that was born after the Thawra. The Thawra being the Palestinian revolution in the 70s and 80s in Lebanon. And this was noted in by other scholars too, scholars of the Palestinian revolution, that people, get acquainted with the factions through kind of these personal relations. Now, certainly that doesn't mean that if you're born into a family where your parents are, let's say, DFLP, that doesn't mean that you'll become DFLP, not at all. But when you want to trace back that initial context, you'll always find a personal relation, like someone who took you, who introduced you to a particular faction. So definitely.
Marcus Hallinan says, excellent talk, Dr. Issa. I look forward to reading your book. With a finite amount of Palestinians in camps, what is the level of competition of the factions/parties trying to attract more supporters? And how common are familial/clan conflicts? Since, as you explained, parties are heavily dependent on interpersonal relationships rather than ideology. Thank you.
Sorry, can you repeat the last part of the question?
So the last part is, so he says, with a finite amount of Palestinians in camps, what is the level of competition of the factions trying to attract more supporters? And how common are familial/clan conflicts? Since, as you explained, parties are heavily dependent on interpersonal relationships rather than ideology.
Yeah. I would say I mean, factions are deeply unpopular. I mean, people don't boost of their affiliation with factions. Again, this is why I chose Nahr al-Barid, where I felt I could get more sincere answers. But like, I have a quote where a young person says, like, being part of a faction has become a crime. So I would say there isn't a lot of competition. In the sense that this is not like, people are in a rush to join factions, and the relationships are very loose, kind of like Mahmoud, one day you're in, one day you're out, you're moving in this kind of gray zone. In terms of fighting, I mean, it depends on the camps. It really is very camp specific, because each camp, because of the civil war, each camp has its own history. They all lived through very different battles, very different contexts. They were invaded, occupied by, you know, different armies. So it varies. But like in Nahr al-Bared, there's very little interfactional fighting. Because again of the nature of the camp that was much more commercial, entrepreneurial. But some other camps, like notoriously Ain al-Hilwe, there's a lot more interfactional fighting. So it really depends on the camp.
Mm-hmm. So Frank Guzman asks, to what extent do factions reinforce or discourage women's participation in politics, especially as candidates in elections?
I would say it depends on the faction and its own kind of, you know, political ideology and what they perceive. But in general, I mean, like there's camps, Shatila camp in Beirut has women on its popular committee. Palestinian women are very much engaged in Palestinian political life. They tend to be more engaged in NGO work than in informal factional work, but not necessarily. For example, the DFLP has a lot of women in leadership positions in the PFLP. So it really comes back to the kind of the ideology of the faction.
Folks, please feel free to add any more questions. I've gone through the questions, and as I wait to see if there are any more, as I said, I have so many questions, so I'll give myself as moderator now the opportunity to ask a few more questions. If that's okay with you, Dr. Issa, I hope we're not exhausting you. But I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your choice of publisher and to publish with the New Directions in Palestinian Studies series. Why were you drawn to that series in particular? And how do you envision your book sort of fitting within the broader discussions that are happening in that context?
Sure. Well, I mean, honestly, I couldn't have picked it. I mean, I feel like it was the ideal place, the best place to be part of the series that really kind of looks at the everyday, that really emphasizes the everyday and kind of the daily experience of people and of refugees. And that kind of backs away from these kind of general geopolitical, you know, international relation approach to Palestinian politics. So I was really honored when you know I was accepted, and also I really appreciate the open access aspect of it, because you know what's the point if I'm writing a book and it's sitting on the shelf, you know not to be read. So that was also a huge incentive. So.
Absolutely, absolutely. And could you share with us what you're working on now in terms of your current and future projects, you know, the sort of intellectual horizon moving forward? What can we anticipate and look forward to?
Sure. Well, now I'm beginning a new project on the political education of actually Palestinians. So it's a continuation, but it kind of looks at how Palestinians, young Palestinians, get their knowledge on Palestine. So not just a sense of identity, or you know, I feel Palestinian as opposed to Lebanese, since you know I'm rejected from Lebanon. But where do they get their actual knowledge? So on the history of Palestine, on you know the political events. So yeah, so this is the beginning, and you know. Unfortunately, again, in this research, it's quite apparent that factions are not playing a role, and that it really comes back to the individuals, to themselves, to a lot of research and a lot of work to learn.
Wow, that's a fascinating project. I wish you all the best with that. Thank you so much, Dr. Issa, for sharing your work with all of us. Thank you to Laura and everyone at IPS. And thank you to the folks who tuned in via Zoom and via Facebook. It's wonderful to be in community with you all. Please take good care and stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you so much.